I think it's Ukraine's attempt to show that this war is still worth fighting. After sort of 2.5 years we're coming up to now, there was a sense perhaps earlier this year that at last perhaps the Russian sort of war machine was overwhelming the Ukrainians, and the meat grinder, they could just outlast them man for man. So by having this shock attempt, it's humiliated Putin and put him back on the back foot. And I think that's important in terms of timing, which is that we're coming up to the winter months now, and also, of course, the US presidential election. So this is a kind of way of trying to rally allies to Ukraine's cause. Zelensky has a thing for symbolism and shock factor. And I think really it's an attempt, the first time since the Second World War to incur upon Ukrainian soil, Russian soil, is a big symbolic moment for Putin, the process of this war.
But does the presence of the Challenger tanks on Russian soil represent an increase in Britain's involvement in the conflict? And should there have been more of a debate about their use beforehand? That's a question I put to Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mail earlier.
I'm a great supporter of the royal prerogative, frankly. I don't like the erosion. It's the responsibility of a government to make decision. If you start outsourcing your decision-making to the public or the media or even domestic politics, I think that's very bad for a country like ours. So I support, clearly the government, the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary have the advice of the Civil Service, they have the advice of the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Defence Staff, etc. They've clearly made it clear to Zelensky, as have other nations, that we've reached a stage in this conflict that this can go forward. I'm not a fan, I'm afraid, of subcontracting decisions that should be taken by the executive to some sort of student debate.
Well, that was Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mail, who's a former Chief of the General Staff. Rosa Prince, we are now seeing British tanks being used by Ukrainian forces on Russian soil. Do you think that there will be concerns that there was no public announcement from the government, certainly no debate in Parliament, which of course is on recess at the moment over the summer. But after all the caution that there has been as this war has developed, are you surprised at what we're seeing now?
A little surprised. Just to say, it made me laugh a bit to hear sort of discussion in Parliament dismissed as student politics.
Yeah, I did point out that we were talking about our elected representatives.
Yeah, I think it was when you heard that this morning and you thought, oh, cripes, really? Are British tanks on Russian soil? That it sort of doesn't sound quite right. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? I think you've sort of got Ed Miliband to blame for executives not wanting to go to Parliament. If you remember, David Cameron had wanted to take action in Syria, and there was a vote in Parliament that Ed Miliband, who was then the Labour leader, led the opposition to, and it got a bit bitter and heated. I suppose if you are Keir Starmer, if you are in government at the moment, the thinking is you don't sort of want to make a great play of this because you don't want to sort of taunt the Russians, as it were. I mean, there's an argument that you could say, as Vladimir Putin already says, that the Ukrainian presence on Russian soil is a provocation, that this would be seen as provocation by the British. I mean, I kind of think it probably isn't seen like that in Moscow, just because their feelings about the UK are already well established, and I can't imagine that this will make a great deal of difference. I understand that the thinking inside the Ministry of Defence is that if we are supporting Ukraine, then we have to trust them to take these decisions. As long as they are doing so within the rules of war, then that's kind of okay with the British government, and this is the logical conclusion of that. As I say, it is a bit startling, but perhaps not surprising when you think about the context.
At every stage during this war, James, we seem to have had incremental shifts. Initially, we were going to send combat vehicles, but not tanks. And then we agreed to send tanks. And then we finally agreed with the Americans that they could at some stage get these fighter jets. It has been a slow moving process, but this does appear to be quite a significant move, doesn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think it's Ukraine's attempt to show that this war is still worth fighting. After sort of 2.5 years we're coming up to now, there was a sense perhaps earlier this year that at last perhaps the Russian sort of war machine was overwhelming the Ukrainians, and the meat grinder, they could just outlast them man for man. So by having this shock attempt, it's humiliated Putin and put him back on the back foot. And I think that's important in terms of timing, which is that we're coming up to the winter months now, and also, of course, the US presidential election. So this is a kind of way of trying to rally allies to Ukraine's cause. Zelensky has a thing for symbolism and shock factor, and I think really it's an attempt, the first time since the Second World War to incur upon Ukrainian soil, Russian soil, sorry, is a big symbolic moment for Putin, the process of this war. I think what you're saying there is interesting in terms of kind of how we have to go. We've sort of been tiptoeing along and sort of acting with the Americans every single time we've had different red lines in all of this. I mean, I remember speaking to a Foreign Office minister at the beginning of the war, and they sort of said Ukraine was paying the blood price in all of this. And I think there is a sense perhaps in the West that the Ukraine's the one sacrificing the body, so we're sort of happy to go up with them up to a point, though it's striking that although we're using Challenger tanks, the Ukrainians using Challenger tanks, they're not using, for instance, British Storm missiles, which I think is an interesting kind of red line perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, apparently it's okay to use tanks, but we're not going to allow them to use these longer range, more powerful missiles.
Yeah, and whenever there's any talk of sort of boots on the ground from the British, I mean, immediately the MOD hoses that one down. So what is the red line? There's talk of one day would Ukraine join NATO? That would obviously make a big difference. What would happen if the war spilled over into a NATO country? Again, that would presumably make a difference. But the last thing Britain wants is to be dragged into conflict. I think there's a big difference between sort of providing this kind of support and really getting caught up in it. So it's going to be interesting to see how long Zelensky can sustain this mission. It's certainly aimed at sort of, as James says, continuing to keep Ukraine in the public eye. It had sort of slipped, obviously, after the Gaza conflict flared up from October. And he's trying to kind of change the weather and say, look, we're still here and we still need support.
And the Labour government, and throughout the election, this was one of the few issues on which the two parties were united. Labour insisting that they were going to continue their support for Ukraine. But it comes at a considerable cost, doesn't it, in terms of the amount of money, in terms of the strain on the MOD and so on, James?
Yes, massively. And of course, this comes at a time when we're under pressure from America. I think whoever wins in November will be keen to kind of for European allies to increase their defence spending. A few weeks ago, I chatted to Woody Johnson, who used to be the US ambassador to the UK, who is expected by a lot of people to return if Trump gets in. And he was saying, I think Trump's going to be encouraging 3% as a target, 3% GDP spending by 2030 instead as a higher target. So I think that's going to be fascinating to watch in terms of kind of international diplomacy here. And of course, all these things are interlinked in terms of different pressure points, etc. And I think that, the British public is an outlier in the sense of how pro-Ukraine it is. It's probably the most pro-Ukrainian country, I think, according to public polling. 3/4 of the public still support it. The danger is, of course, is if we do have to have some kind of compromise or bargaining, how do we bring the public along with that? I think will probably be about what Zelensky wants. And I think the government's made very clear they'll stand with whatever Zelensky wants. The key thing is Zelensky's own position, which is that if he has to then argue for a negotiation and perhaps concession of Ukrainian territory, how that goes with the public, who has have to see brothers, friends, fathers, loved ones all lay down their lives for something which isn't perhaps the total victory they wanted.
Yeah, and I mean, the other factor in all of this, when we look at the international repercussions, is what happens in the United States. Donald Trump, of course, has said that he's going to solve the war in 24 hours, but the Ukrainians are very worried that he's going to try and somehow make some kind of deal with President Putin, which is not what the Ukrainians want. There's still a strong possibility Donald Trump could end up as the next president of the United States. And his deputy, J.D. Vance, said not so long ago that he doesn't care about Ukraine.
Yeah, that was something that was very much sort of part of the narrative during the Republican National Congress a couple of weeks ago, where Donald Trump was formally adopted as the candidate. And a lot of British politicians, Conservative politicians, actually went out there to talk to Donald Trump, particularly Boris Johnson has kind of made it his post-Downing Street mission to champion Ukraine on the international stage. And they sort of came away saying, yeah, it's great, Donald Trump's absolutely supportive. And then within a few hours, he named J.D. Vance as his vice presidential candidate. Vance is someone who is deeply sceptical about backing the war and kind of speaks to those isolationist instincts that Donald Trump already had. So I'm sure President Zelensky will be concerned about the possible return of Donald Trump. He'll be hoping that Kamala Harris takes a different view.
The key thing, of course, is there is a negotiation. It's best to have as many bargaining chips as possible, hence this offensive and why it gives Zelensky with a stronger hand.
Yeah, David's got in touch to say we spend £2 or £3 billion in military aid on Ukraine annually, minimal 0.1% of GDP, less than we should, really. And there is, I think, isn't there, within this government a real concern that, I mean, they accept the argument that President Zelensky and that Ukraine make all the time is that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, well, what next? And that is the concern, isn't it, of Britain, the United States and other NATO allies.
Absolutely, and it's all different fields as well. And this is the argument the British are making and should be making to Trump's camp as well, of course, is about Taiwan. The danger is that if we don't stand up for Ukraine in Europe, what's to stop China and Taiwan, and the whole issue of Western resolve comes into it. The other is an immensely cynical calculation, but it's probably the right one as well, which is about, what price to wear down the Russian war machine. We're not sacrificing, British lives on the scale of Ukraine. We're watching them fight this fight. And yet for those figures, as you mentioned there, we're going to be, Russian is completely focused on that one conflict, and it's going to cost them a huge amount in men, personnel and treasure as well.
Just finally, Rosa, in terms of the British involvement, do you think that when Parliament does return in just a couple of weeks' time, only for a week or so before they then go on another break for the conferences, that there will be some questions for the government about this, about what used to be called mission creep?
Yeah, I'm sure there will be questions. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, to see what the government's approach is to Parliament. I mean, look, they were only there for a couple of weeks, as you say, before they disappeared off on holiday, and we haven't quite established what the relationship between the executive and the legislature is going to be. Now, I think the fact that it's a Parliament that's made up largely of Labour MPs means that if they do want to have these debates in public, then it's a friendly House of Commons. It's not like when Tony Blair, I mean, he did have a large majority at the time when it was the Iraq War, but it was, there were many, they'd been around for a bit longer, there were elements that were deeply hostile. I think because there are so many new MPs, they've probably got that kind of honeymoon that will last within the party. On the other hand, there are a few independents there. The left of the party is still around who may be a bit more hostile to this. So, it's one of the things I'm going to be keeping an eye